welcome you all here today. Just a couple of general updates before we begin. So firstly, I'd like to take a moment to acknowledge and introduce you to the CCNet North American Regional Network core team members that are with us today. So perhaps you can flip your camera on and give a wave if it isn't on already. So we've got Sarah Gottlieb. We have John Morrison. We have Dave Pearsall. And a quick scan of the participant list. I didn't see any others, but we've also got Terry Schultz, Andrew Bridges, and John Pascus on the network team. Just a reminder that we are here and we exist and are here to support coaches. So please feel free to reach out or connect with us if you'd like to join the network. And then secondly, we wanted to ensure everyone is aware that planning for an in-person CCNet rally in beautiful Victoria, Canada is underway. So the dates for the rally are October 17th to the 21st. So we hope you can join us. And I'll share the rally website in the chat for more information in just a moment. So without further ado, I'm excited and honored to welcome Nick Salafsky and Robyn Irvine as our speakers today. Nick is the Executive Director and Co-founder of Foundations of Success. He's also the Product Manager for Marathi. Robyn is an ecologist with Parks Canada. She's also a senior ecologist and owner of Poisson Consulting Limited and an adjunct professor at the University of British Columbia. So Nick and Robyn will be sharing an approach with us today developed by FoS and Parks Canada that enables practitioners to evaluate evidence for the assumptions that we make that underlie our specific conservation strategies. So I'll turn it over to you, Nick and Robyn. Thank you.
I muted myself to cough. Okay, thanks, Brenda, and thanks to everyone who's coming and to CCNet for sponsoring this. I'm Nick, and I'm here with Robyn, and we are going to present a few slides, probably talk for, I don't know, 30 minutes or so, kind of outlining this approach that we've been working on. We'll give you a little bit about the approach and then some of the ways we pilot tested and used it. And then we'll reserve the remainder of the call for questions, comments, thoughts, ideas that you all might have. And so we'll kind of dive into it. Some of you may have seen parts of this before, but it is an evolving subject, so hopefully you'll find something new in here that will be of interest. So as advertised, this is a practical approach, hopefully, to assessing existing evidence for specific conservation strategies. And evidence is something that a lot of people talk about. People want to have evidence for the strategies or the work that they're doing. And as we started into this journey a few years ago, we discovered that evidence is maybe something everybody's talking about, but it's actually very confusing. What do we actually mean by evidence? And we even consulted the philosophers, and they too found it difficult. We knew it had something to do with our theories of change. And if we want to, say, protect nesting seabirds on an island from rat predation, that we might be trying different interventions like a rat barrier on boats. And then the question is, does that assumption hold? Will that actually work? And that seems to be sort of the classic use of evidence, is to sort of test if that strategy is working. But as we'll get into it, we discovered it's actually a little bit more complicated than that. This work started with methodology that was first developed by FoS and Conservation Measures Partnership, and then refined and extended to this work with the Parks Canada folks. So that was the original paper that was put together in 2019. That evolved a bit into a book that we just put out. But in particular, this is based on work that we did working on caribou restoration in Jasper National Park, and then with Robyn and her colleagues in the core program in Parks Canada, Conservation and Restoration, where we looked at, as Robyn will show you, a bunch of different case studies of trying to think about how to apply evidence to the work that's going on there. And all that's been boiled out and put together in a paper, which we are pleased to say just came out in February in Conservation Science and Practice. And so what we're going to be talking about is really covered in this paper. So it asks the question then, what is evidence? And we are going to define evidence as the data, information, knowledge, and wisdom that's used to assess one or more assumptions related to a question of interest. There's a lot of words there. It stems from this traditional pyramid where you start with the underlying data, so what you see in the world in terms of people's projects and strategies, their targets, their threats, their actions. You synthesize that data and hopefully come up with information, so that can be published about case studies of one place or randomized controlled trials, experimental things. All that information is then boiled down further to create knowledge and synthesized. And if you're really lucky, you get guidance. And the idea is that you take evidence from specific cases and you synthesize it and make sense of it. And then that evidence can be used, that generic evidence then informs ongoing practice. So there's a whole loop here that we're trying to set up and go around this pyramid here. And evidence is really about this entire pyramid. Some people think evidence is only data and information and not knowledge and wisdom. We find it easier to think about all this stuff that informs how practice is done. And that leads us to an evolving lexicon. And that leads me to pass it over to Robyn to take you through some of the fun we had with words.
Thanks, Nick. So one of the things that's really happened, as Nick said, is kind of an evergreen approach. As we start to apply it in these pilot project settings, we learn what does and doesn't work. And one of the things that is, I'm sure most coaches are very aware, is that these ecological and conservation questions are embedded in the social context in which we work. And not everyone is a scientist, and not everyone comes from a Western science background. So the original idea of having hypotheses and claims wasn't always relevant to different situations, or easily understandable to different audiences. And so this lexicon has sort of shifted to be as accessible as possible by having an overarching analytical question that we're trying to ask and answer about the system as a need to know to proceed with an effective conservation action, and the assumptions that are underneath that analytical question. So that is still what you would classically define as a hypothesis or claim. It's still familiar, that definition. That's something we believe to be true, that we need to determine what the evidence is for it, but much less ideological and aligned with a particular knowledge system. And then, as Nick already outlined, particularly in a Parks Canada setting and in a Canadian setting where the Canadian government is on a path to learn how to reconcile with Indigenous nations, learning how to incorporate different ways of knowing and different types of knowledge and evidence is a very active area of study and a very active area of conservation on the ground. So this is what a claim used to be and still is in many other places, is an assumption about a system with existing evidence, and a hypothesis is one that requires evidence. The assumption is really more of an accessible articulation of that question of interest, and we'll get into some concrete examples. The assumptions can be very specific and case generative. In the example just given about the rats and seabirds, it could be about that particular island or that particular type of island. Is it a temperate ecosystem? Is it a tropical ecosystem? And a generic assumption might be looking at proposition about the more general situation, invasive rats on seabird islands. So it just gives us into these sort of different levels of hierarchy of assumption and about the evidence that would support it. So for specific assumptions, we obviously need specific evidence to support or refute that assumption. Next slide, please. So we tried to really work this through in a way that was as practical as possible, hence the title of the paper, and as doable as possible by very busy people in the conservation field. And we'll have a bit of a discussion about that later. So step one is identifying those critical questions and assumptions requiring evidence. What do we need to know in the system? How are we asking that is very important to both be representative of the real question that we're trying to get at, and also reflective of the different partners, rights holders, and stakeholders. Step two is to then assemble and assess the specific and generic evidence for each of those assumptions that build underneath the critical questions. Step three is to then go through that evidence and see, how confident are we? If we're really confident, there's not much more to do as far as the gathering of evidence. We can just proceed. If we're not very confident or we have some uncertainties, that's a pointer towards additional work that needs doing, additional research or gathering of knowledge. And step four is to validate the assessment and adapt as needed. And this we'll get into a little bit in the pilot projects that we'll describe later, but this validation can be as simple as an internal check if it's a very simple question or a lower risk question, or it can be a fairly extensive external review process if it's a high risk situation, like the last caribou is going to blink out. Next slide. So this is, of course, very strongly linked to how we work in the conservation standards. So we start with a situation assessment where we're looking at a target of seabirds. They're a culturally important food source, let's say, to a local group, and that gets built out to the risk on those seabirds is the biophysical factor is nest predation, and the direct threat is the predation by the invasive rats, and continues to build out in the normal way with the contributing factors of the lack of biosecurity practices and reintroductions of the rats to islands from vessels. When we're thinking about extracting the questions from this, really it is looking at those steps through the situation diagram and asking in it and articulating those questions. So we've just done them in purple. So do our seabirds require conservation action? Is it a robust population that's doing okay? Is it just a minor little population in the whole world of this particular species? Or in this case, the assumption underneath that question is that the seabird populations on the islands are globally important. The populations are in a bad state, so they do require conservation action because they have a very low viability status. And that's an assumption, again, that we would dig into to find the evidence for. And thirdly, that historically they were a culturally important food source. So this is one that clearly points to a different way of knowing and a different knowledge base than potentially Western science, in this case, Indigenous knowledge, to inform it. A second critical question associated with this situational diagram is then, are rats the major threat to our seabird populations? Assumptions under that is certainly that, what are the major causes of mortality for seabirds? And is nest predation one of the critical ones? i.e., if you have evidence to prove that and you pull that lever in your restoration action, will it be effective? We'll get to that in the theory of change pathway. Assumption 2, rats are the primary cause of nest predation. Number 3, other sources of nest predation are less of an issue, i.e., if the evidence shows that if you deal with rats, you deal with the problem. And number 4, that marine vessels are the major cause of rat reintroduction to the islands. So we're really just taking this diagram and turning into a series of questions we can then derive the evidence for. Same typical process when we go from that situational diagram into the theory of change pathway, except now we're looking at those strategies. We've got, can we get nest predation to an acceptable level by eliminating the rats from the key islands? With the rat control efforts and the alternative eradication strategies as our 2 main strategies here, and the steps in the results chain outlined as per normal. And so what we're doing with the questions and the assumptions here is really, what evidence do we have that each step, each if-then statement you're making in the theory of change pathway is supported or refuted by the evidence? Is rat eradication effective? So we look at both the generic assumption of that and the specific assumption. Will traditional landowners agree to rat control so that we can actually do this work? Social buy-in. Implementing this control effort will actually eliminate the rats. If rats are eliminated, seabird nest predation will be at acceptable levels. And second to that is, are there other rat management strategies we should be applying? So you can see that we're just articulating the questions and then the assumptions to derive the skeleton on which we hang our evidence. So there's the summary in the left-hand column of the 5 analytical questions that would frame to form a complete picture of the case we need to make to proceed with the restoration action. And all 5 of them need to be answered in order for us to proceed with our proposed rat eradication strategy with the backing to know that it's very likely to be effective. Each of these can be expanded so that you can then put the assumptions under each question. And so you can see that blown out here. And the other columns we'll go into a little bit more, Nick will go into shortly here, but you can see that what we're doing is we're attributing the documentation of evidence to a particular person. So if it's me looking up things and talking to locals, I would put Robyn Irvine, May 4th, and explain what the evidence is. How specific is it? Is it to that island? Is it generic? Is it proximate, i.e. same ecosystem? And then we get into the other stages. Next slide. So this is when we start to get into what I was just articulating, the assembling of the evidence. So these are some examples of specific evidence. So I worked on a project in Guayhanas National Park Reserve in British Columbia. So specific evidence for that, where invasive rats were on the islands, is that, data from camera traps demonstrated that rats were the primary cause of seabird predation. There were also raccoons and other predators that were there, but rats were the primary ones. So that would be very strongly supporting. Indigenous knowledge that seabirds have been populous, an important part of the local diet, tells us that not only is our normal census data accurate at the local level, but also that Indigenous knowledge supports that over thousands and thousands of years. Proximate evidence is from a conceptually close situation that could be spatially, ecologically, or temporally. And there's a couple examples there for you. And the final is generic evidence. So that's really from the rest of the world. What do we know about other systems and programs that are similar? Tropical systems with rats and seabirds, et cetera, or systematic reviews, rapid evidence assessment reviews, or other nations. Over to you, Nick.
Thanks, Robyn. So what Robyn's just walked you through is probably that first step, and then just starting to get into the second step, which for most people is the hardest part of this whole process. It's figuring out what questions to ask and what assumptions you're making that you need to actually get evidence for. What we really believe is you can't talk about evidence until you've articulated those questions and those assumptions. And so for most people, it's really hard. This is where you're all lucky because you guys work with the conservation standards. And I think a key part of the conservation standards has always been laying out those situation analyses and those theories of change pathways that Robyn just showed you. And those have always, we've known, being composed of assumptions. And the art of this is really articulating the ones that are most important for which we want to get evidence and then lay them out here. So this table, if you tried to create this table absent a theory of change diagram or a situation analysis, I think it'd be really difficult. But if you have those, you can hopefully take those. And then the challenge is not to show everything, but show the right pieces of it that you're going to put into this table. But this is really coming up with those questions and now then assembling the evidence that we need to make the case for the strategy. And one thing I will say about that combined thing is that you can see that to make the case, we're looking at both the current situation as well as the theory of change looking forward. We need to bring both those tools together to make the case for this potential strategy. So now we have this grid here with our questions. And now we have to assemble those three different kinds of evidence that Robyn talked about. But the thing is, as you'll see, it's really expensive to go spend a ton of time searching the world for evidence. And so to make this practical, we're encouraging people to start with what you know locally. What do you know at specific evidence, or maybe from a neighboring island, that proximate evidence that Robyn mentioned. And to be really blunt, the line between what is specific versus proximate, which is versus generic, it's a little bit of fuzziness. But you kind of use your judgment. You say, okay, well, here's what we already know. So what we know locally is annual surveys show seabird population rapidly declining on 4 of the 7 islands. And as Robyn described, the elders described the traditional harvest. So there are certain things that we already know. So we're going to lay out that specific and proximate evidence. We're going to talk about who's making the evidence. And then we're going to weigh that evidence that we have from those local available resources. Some of you may have seen parts of this before, but there's really 4 criteria on which you can officially assess evidence, each piece of evidence, and then the overall evidence base. So using the metaphor of a balance that we're putting the pieces of evidence on, one of the criteria is how reliable is the evidence. So more or heavier pieces of evidence are more reliable, whereas there's less reliable pieces of evidence that we're not going to give literally as much weight when we place them on the balance. If you talk to the systematic review people, they're going to talk about things like systematic reviews or double-blind controlled studies being more reliable than anecdotes. As we get into this in the practical sense, I'm not sure that's always true. If you have a very reliable story from a very reliable elder, I might give that a very high reliability. I mean, there's a judgment call to this if we have different ways of knowing, different ways of thinking about things. But one way or another, you're going to have to sort of say, how much credibility am I going to put in each piece of evidence that I have? That's the reliability. We're also going to talk about the direction. So are we putting the evidence on the refuting side of the balance or on the supporting side of the balance? We're also then going to talk about the strength. So basically, using the balance metaphor, do we put it nearer the fulcrum where it'll have less weight, less impact on the overall balance? Or do we put it further out because it really strongly supports that piece of evidence? So how far from the fulcrum are you going to put it? And then the last piece of the puzzle is relevance. Is the evidence even relevant to the question? And this is where the proximate and local evidence becomes really important, because in general, local evidence, for reasons I'll talk about in a second, is generally going to be more relevant, whereas evidence from the other side of the world, you have to make more of a judgment call of whether it's going to be relevant or whether it applies to your situation. But that's even true for some local evidence. You have to make that assessment of whether that piece of evidence should even be on the balance or not. So you weigh all those pieces of evidence and you come up with your net balance of how these things work. So again, to summarize, the direction of the effect, supporting versus refuting, the strength of effect, strong evidence convincingly supports or refutes a claim, weak evidence only somewhat or supports or refutes a claim. The reliability, so how quality is that evidence that we're dealing with, and then the relevance. And this is why the relevance is so important in particular. It comes down to what David Hume and Karl Popper talked about, inductive reasoning and Popper's induction fallacy. And the easiest example I have of that is, let's say you're interested in poisoning rats on an island, and you have a study that's consulted 100 different instances of poisoning of rodents around the world. And in all those cases, this poisoning protocol that you're going to use was incredibly effective. So it's a really robust, really strong study that shows that poisoning rodents works on these islands. But if the 100 islands that were in that study are all dry islands, and you happen to be working on a very wet and rainy island, and you put the poison out, and the poison rain gets rained out and washes in the sea and doesn't work, then your 101st island isn't going to work. And this is why, if you're going from many cases to your particular case, you have to know that the conditions under which you're using it are comparable and useful, and that the tool is, or the approach you're using is going to work in that case in which you're on. And that's why relevance is so interesting. It's also very difficult. The more time we spend on this, the more we realize it's an art to deciding whether a source of evidence is relevant or not. And all the double-blind controlled studies in the world aren't going to really help you unless you have such power that the case in which you're working on is likely to be included in that sample that was originally done, which is very difficult in conservation. It works more in the medical case. So there's a whole bunch of ways of assessments that you have to do of that evidence. So in our methodology, what we're proposing is you start with a critical and well-formulated specific assumption within a pathway. And you ask, again, as I just showed you, do we have specific evidence that supports the specific assumption? And then there's I think I skipped some of the matrices hidden here. Sorry about this. It's out of order. Okay, never mind. So, okay, so we start with this. My bad. So we start with a specific assumption supports the assumption. And if it convincingly supports, if you know enough locally to answer whether that assumption is going to hold, and you, for whatever reason, you know enough locally, then you proceed with the pathway, you get on with the work. And conversely, if your local evidence tells you that what you're going to do is never going to work, it's refuted, well, then don't waste any more time on it, and you better figure out a different pathway. And so this is the really important thing. If you know enough locally, you get on with it. If you're less sure, then we get into this matrix situation where you can put your degree of support for the information here, strongly, weakly, mixed, refutes, and across the top, the strength of your evidence space, very high, high, medium, low, or none. And then you can use this matrix to combine them to get up your confidence in the assumption. So we're asking people to do the same thing here, where you might take that evidence, you might ask, does the specific evidence support the claim, and rate the direction and strength. So here we have not clear, strongly supports, refutes, weakly supports, not clear. You hit that with the evidence quality. So that's none, low, high, medium, high, low. And you use that matrix and you come up with your confidence in that assumption. And here, so we're very confident in at least assumption A3, we're confident but in B2, but with our local evidence and proximate evidence, we still need a lot more information. We don't really have enough to proceed. So we have a bunch of additional information needs that we need to think about. So this is our first pass through this evidence assessment using both specific evidence and proximate evidence. So if it's not clear, or potentially supports, if we're in this messier light green or yellow, then we have to move to the next step. And that's really looking at external evidence. But before that, we're going to take a quick detour and talk about the required level of proof. So if you're in a situation where there's not a lot of consequences for getting the wrong action or taking the wrong step, then you probably shouldn't be wasting a lot of time on getting evidence. Just get on with the work. In general, if you're going to be at a lower required level of proof, if it's kind of ordinary work, it's everyday work, it doesn't have a lot of consequences if you get wrong, you can do a less intensive evidence synthesis. Conversely, if you're at a higher required level of proof, then you need to do a more intensive evidence synthesis. So in the examples that we were using for our work, with the caribou and jasper, which was the last population of this endangered caribou population, and the government of Canada was going to spend a lot of money, and there were a lot of stakeholders who were watching this and ready to pounce if they got things wrong, then yeah, we were in that higher, much more intensive evidence synthesis. In most of the other cases, well, we were in that lower, less evidence synthesis. We're not going to spend quite so much time on it. So you determine your level of proof. Based on that, you then do your evidence synthesis, and you go out and say, what does the rest of the world know about my problem? Is there generic evidence that supports our assumption? So again, most of our pilots had the lower, Jasper had the higher. If you get here, and then you get to convincingly support, then you proceed with your pathway with verification monitoring. If it refutes, you consider alternative pathways. If you're confident, but you probably move on with your work, but you're going to have to do a little bit more monitoring to make sure to check things are going on. And if you're still in the unclear yellow, you need more information, then if you have time, you might want to do some research, or you might want to really do some more evidence synthesis and really try to answer the question. Or if it's urgent that you act, you can still act, but then you're in the full monitoring and adaptive management case that many of us are familiar with. So it's really guiding both, not just what we do, but also the amount of monitoring or follow-up or checking that we have to do as we do that work. So this is what it looks like. So this was the situation, remember, where we just had the specific evidence, the proximate evidence. We then clear the form. We come in and add our generic evidence. So we're looking at what the rest of the world knows about these assumptions that we're making, these questions that we're asking. We then reassess our degree of support, and we reassess our weight of evidence. We use that matrix to come up with our confidence in the assumptions. And that gives us our more final rating of these assumptions based on all the evidence that we're now pulling together. Step 3 is then to think about what are the implications. And so what we've done here, if you go back, is we've answered our confidence in each assumption. We now have to roll that up into our confidence for the question. And Robyn and I have been debating a whole bunch of different ways of doing this. The best methodology that we've come up with now, but probably still needs some more work, is something we're calling the weakest critical link approach, where you might want to look at the criticality of each of these assumptions. Is it essential to your argument, critical, not critical, less critical? And for anything that's essential or critical, then the rating for the question is the same as the rating of the lowest confidence for any of the critical or essential assumptions that you have down below. So in this case, confident but is the lowest for an essential, so we give the overall rating confident but. In this case, need more information is for these assumption and critical, so we're going to give this need more information. So it's a way of rolling these things up. There are probably other ways to do that and sort of more mathematical ways of doing that, which we could talk about as we go into it. But we're going to list out those confidence in our overall question. We're also going to talk about our additional information needs, so that to start to jumpstart our ongoing monitoring work. And then we'll come back to our summary of making the case for the proposed rat eradication strategy. And this summary comes from the summary in those questions, our current confidence in the evidence. So here we can summarize the work. We can talk about the management implications of that confidence in our evidence, and we can talk about the additional information needs that we might have that's going to drive and jumpstart our future monitoring plan. So again, to move forward with this eradication strategy, we have to be answering and thinking about all these different questions. In this case, we're not confident that we can keep the rats from reinvading, and the management implications are pretty severe. Until we can figure out to solve this problem, wiping out the rats will only be a temporary fix at best. So maybe we shouldn't go forward with that work. We have a red flag. We have a problem with this particular strategy. This is the kind of thinking that we kind of need to do in order to be able to proceed with this kind of this management approach. And then the fourth step is to validate the assessment and iteratively adapt as needed. As Robyn mentioned, a lot of this has to do with your required burden or level of proof. So the simple way to do it is, in most of the cases, is we just get some peers to look at our assumption, because this is the project team stating their own assumption and their own weighting of it. So you might want to get a few outsiders to look over it and make sure that they agree with what the team did. In the case of the caribou, which I told you was very high stakes and there was a lot of attention on it, in this case, we actually compiled the evidence here in this first part of the sheet. We then convened 30 experts from around the world and put them in 5 groups, and each of the 5 groups independently reviewed the assessments that the team had made and gave their concurrence with it. And then we kind of used that to revise the assumptions that we were making. And then we had a big plenary session to kind of work through and vote and get agreement from the experts. So by the time we've gone through all this, we actually have a fair amount of confidence that the evidence is what it is and whether we want to proceed. You can do these more detailed processes if you need to in the situation where that's required. So in summary, there are these 4 different steps in the process. Identify the critical questions and assumptions requiring evidence, assemble the specific generic evidence for each assumption, determine the confidence, and validate the assessment and iteratively adapt as needed. One of the things I hope has become evident is that you can do this at different levels of intensity. You can do this very quick and dirty and kind of run through it with whatever evidence you have, or you can do a much more structured decision-making process. You can weigh the evidence for each piece of evidence and kind of do different rankings and assign mathematical ranks. Like a lot of the open standards, conservation standards processes, we're pretty agnostic at what level of detail you go through it, and you can do it as intensively or unintensively as you want. So this approach can be built into any decision support framework. So for example, if you're doing structured decision-making and you have a bunch of consequence tables, they're really a bunch of assumptions that are going into your consequence tables. And we can then get the evidence needed to test each of those assumptions. We're, of course, very interested in the conservation standards. And so we're building this into the conservation standards processes. And we're actually, as already today, building the Marathi. Hopefully in a couple of weeks, you'll be able to go into Marathi and actually get a tool to be able to put these questions and assumptions in Marathi and sprinkle them through your diagrams, and then have those sheets flowing from it that you could actually do the evidence ratings. So as a conclusion of the overview, I hope it's scared you all a little bit. And if I were a practitioner and I just saw that presentation, I would in some ways be asking myself the question, how the bleep can we possibly find the time to do this evidence collection for all our conservation work? It's already hard enough what you all are asking us to do, to lay out a theory of change and to lay out a situation analysis and do the monitoring and all this other stuff. And we're busy as it is, and it's already a ton of work. And now you want us to collect all this evidence? But on the other hand, we would turn the question around and sort of say, if we're dealing with the time and treasure of our stakeholders, if we're trying to deal with the last populations of these endangered species we're working on, how do we possibly not find the time to do this critical thinking and evidence collection for all our conservation work? Do you really want to spend all this time, 5 years, setting up a rat eradication strategy where the evidence very early on pointed on that if you couldn't stop the rats from reinvading, the whole thing was useless? So I think we really have to find that right balance between doing this quick and dirty enough so it's not too onerous, but making sure we're doing the critical thinking and evidence collection for our work. And so some of you have seen this graph before, but it's this idea that as we invest more in evidence acquisition and analysis, we improve the probability of making a correct decision. And in a high burden of proof, you might want to spend a fair amount of time getting to point C, which is sort of optimizing the work you've done. So this is the gold standard. You might do systematic reviews, or you might do controlled experiments, or everything you need to do to get to that final most correct probability decision. But for the vast majority of work, you're probably better off somewhere here, where at least you lay out your assumptions, check out what you know locally, check out a few sources of evidence, and think about maximizing your return on investment evidence. So we are not necessarily advocating for point C at all times. We're thinking that in many cases, you're better off being back here. So again, if you know based on local assumptions, experience that the assumption will hold, do it already and get on with the work. And if you know it's not going to work, think about something else. So we're really trying to not require external evidence reviews for every decision, but only where it's going to help and where it's going to be useful to your work. And so I'll skip over that, but and this we'll get into this in more detail. But the last piece I want to talk about is how existing evidence is one component of your overall sources of evidence. And so if you think about this existing evidence and acquiring and generating new evidence, and then you can think of working inside your program or outside your program, what we've talked about is the specific evidence base and the generic evidence base for existing evidence that you're using to track for work that you're going to do in the future. You're sort of assessing what's already known to then check on or plan your future work. As you implement that work, we then get into the familiar conservation standards realms of program monitoring or collaborative learning, where you're acquiring and generating new evidence about hypotheses that you're holding going forward about how the world works that you're monitoring. Research is also a part of that work as well, and there's a relation there. But what we find over time is as time moves forward, as our projects and programs are implemented and we do our monitoring, we're going to acquire new information, which is going to feed into the evidence base. So there's kind of an ongoing accumulation of evidence over time that increases the evidence base that allows us to get smarter about what we're doing. So with that, I'm going to end the overview part and turn it back to Robyn to talk a little bit about some of our pilots.
Thanks, Nick. So as Nick said at the start, the Conservation and Restoration Program at Parks Canada is a large-scale program to advance restoration goals within protected areas. And so we selected 3 projects to use as our pilots, and then Jasper Caribou, which was also a previous core project Nick's talked about a little bit, became a 4th with a bit more intensive external review. So this is just a brief overview. Given the time, I'm not going to go into it. We picked these projects specifically because they were at different stages, and we wanted to see what the utility of this approach was to project managers. What did they get out of it for what they were putting into it? So the Guayana Seabird project, Skinhanastitha, was completed, and it was part of my former job. And so I wanted to use this to sort of see how it worked as a documentation of institutional memory for the state of a project upon completion. The Atlantic Salmon Project, which is a multi-park restoration project, 5 national parks in the Eastern Atlantic setting of Parks Canada, was sort of mid-project, and I wanted to sort of see whether this was useful for them. They have a very active research program tied to these projects, and see how that worked. And the Waterton one was going through a transition, just sort of at the beginning of the project. So next slide, please, Nick. The time investment for these was really dependent on the knowledge of the project team. So what we found was that even though this seems like a lot of work, most of the project managers who'd been involved in the projects for quite a while in the technical capacity as well as the management capacity had a lot of this knowledge at their fingertips. They just didn't have it documented anywhere in a cohesive and coherent way. So each of the 3 projects from core, the top 3 there, already had situational diagrams in Marathi and had subject matter experts that were accessible to us through the pilot project. So it took about 20 folks to develop those initial 20 person hours, pardon me, to develop the initial claims, and 20 person hours to assemble the evidence. The Jasper Caribou situation, because of the risk and the level of proof required, had a significantly greater resource investment for us to match to that level of risk. Next slide. So I'm just going to give you a quick overview of one of the pilot projects. So we worked with them to articulate the project goals and targets through the situational diagram, kind of came up with a very brief thumbnail version that could be shared with managers of what the project was doing, including a map, which would obviously could be done in Marathi Share. We used Google Sheets for the pilot, but as Nick said, we're trying to look at how to embed all of this in the software. Next slide. And then we went through the process that you've just had outlined, 1, 2, 3, 4, to define the questions and assumptions and how each of those was supported or refuted by the evidence. And what it allowed us to do in this roll up of, you can see this is an older slide with claims still in it. So those would be the assumptions. You can see that our final assessment rolled up in the 3rd column to the right is really just showing us where we need more information. So they didn't have a lot of information on the return or non-return of migratory bull trout into one of their focus creeks. So they knew they had to focus their monitoring on that in the future. And then the other one was whether non-native fish removal would actually improve population demographics for this threatened species of bull trout in these rivers. And so this is a summary roll-up of an entire process, but it really articulated, oh, a muzzle whistling, interesting. I don't know what that is, Christian, sorry. Sorry, guys. So that was kind of the roll up of that particular project. Next slide. So after the Parks Canada team had gone through this, we asked them, this was several folks who'd worked on these projects across, oh good, what was useful? So they identified particular things. What was really useful to me and other members of the pilot team was that clear definition of the underlying assumptions. Sometimes these assumptions are in the background, but are never really articulated, and they really do play in how effective we can be. It helped us all to work on the logical flow and to refine the assumptions we were making, to clarify the connections. We also found, I don't think this is documented here, Nick, but we also found that it articulated challenges in the situational diagram or the theories of change pathway. So if the theory of change pathway had been done without a sort of a pretty clear adherence to a logical flow, it required some iterative work between the two. It also helped us learn where we needed to get more information and gave the opportunity and motivation to document how the decisions were being made for the project. So that link between the conservation standards. What was less useful, everyone who we brought to the pilot team had already, as I said, a situational diagram and some basic conservation standards training or more advanced. Yeah, it took time, it took resources, it took support, particularly in the form of Nick and Judy Bosch-Oven from Foundations of Success to help clarify our logic and thinking. And so sometimes what we're looking at now is looking at sort of a quick and dirty version, as Nick said, for people who just want to document, and a more intensive version for people in a higher risk. One of the biggest issues that would be interesting to discuss is it can create an echo chamber depending on who's in the room. In which you're confirming your own assumptions as a project team. So there needs to be an appropriate level of peer review and feedback. And social science perspectives in the pilot group we had were generally lacking because we were mostly coming from a conservation biology background. Next slide. The improvements on the process, we've already started a bit of work in this area, but integrating this with the conservation standards strategic planning as an early part of project planning was identified critically, because we were kind of going backwards to our situational diagrams and theories of change pathways, like I said, and back and forth. Find a way to break this into smaller, more manageable chunks, help people collect the right information, more direct consideration of Indigenous knowledge. This is an interesting challenge because the types of evidence from different ways of knowing often don't marry to this kind of linear way of documenting. If you're looking at a way of knowing that's representing their knowledge in a dance, you may or may not be able to represent it in this kind of spreadsheet. So it's really thinking about how to do this respectfully and inclusively without a huge bias. Providing better examples of different kinds of evidence, including negative. I think those are all good. You guys are all reading those. And then I'm not sure I'll get into this because this is particular to our agency, how the process could be incorporated, but really it was looking at how do we integrate it into processes so it's not an extra thing. So the whole principle of replacement instead of addition. So if they're having to do a final report, do we instead put a template in Marathi Share that if they actually manage to go through the entire conservation standards process, a report is produced at the end. And this is over to you, I think, Nick. I think Nick just put some ideas for initial questions for discussion to the group.
Yeah, so we had some questions to prompt, but you all may have other questions as well. And we'd love to hear what you all have to say. So I don't know, Brenda, how you want to do this. If you want to take questions in the chat or people unmute themselves, or what do you typically do in these sessions?
Well, this is actually my first time doing this. Sarah, is there a standard approach that we typically use?
Not necessarily. I think it's a good idea to see what's been going on in the chat. There's been a little bit of discussion. I don't think any specific questions. So maybe folks, if you have a question, either put an R in the chat or raise your hand so we can see it in the reactions, or just unmute yourself and go ahead and ask. Oh, Christina has a question.
Hello, thank you so much for sharing this. I definitely see, us using this in the projects that I help coach. And I think, to some degree, we've all been thinking about this and applying it to some degree, maybe not in such a thorough way and in ways of documenting it. So I look forward to, looking at the tool you put together more. And I know, Nick, you mentioned that this will be embedded in Mirati. And I was wondering if it will only be available in Mirati Share, or if for people who don't have stable internet connections, it might also be available as an add-on. I think you mentioned Google Sheets or in the desktop version, so that we know, how to make use of this, because I think, even as an Excel or spreadsheet, it could be really useful. And I would also think about linking it to the whole MEL process of learning agendas, and which is the way how I've done it in other processes, to just keep tabs of the learning components throughout the process as I go through. And so it resonates a lot with my projects.
So the short answer, Christina, is it's definitely being built into Mirati Online. Some of the functionality, at least, is also going to be available on desktop. So the ability to at least float those purple bubbles with your questions and assumptions there is going to be available on desktop. Whether the integrated sheets where you would actually track that are going to be available in desktop, I don't know yet. But at a minimum, you could then, like you say, track it in Google Sheets or Excel or Smartsheets or whatever you're using to create your own tables. And hopefully we have, at least those tables will be integrated in Mirati Online. And then, yeah, I agree with you. I think that what's so exciting about this is it integrates evidence and assessing existing evidence with your whole MEL plan. And so part of this is then setting up those questions and then the monitoring, and then it becomes the evidence. And so stay tuned. We're going to be working on a lot of ways of integrating this into that MEL world. It's kind of a little bit, I kind of skipped over the slides. It kind of came from the Pathways to Success book. Let's see if I can get back here real quick. But what it's really made me think about is that evidence is really part of this cloud that sits around your program. And so in the old days, we used to talk about steps 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, and monitoring was sort of a discrete step, or evidence was a discrete step in the conservation standards. I don't believe that so much anymore. I really do think you're doing your program, your situation, your strategy, operations, and you have this cloud of information around your program or your project, some of which is existing evidence, some is your monitoring, evaluation, research, some is collaborative learning. And it's all sort of informing and breathing in and out these little stoma, these little pores here, informing your project over time. Other questions?
Doug, do you want to come off of mute and ask your question?
Yeah, thank you, Nick. And I'm sorry, I was driving, so I've already forgotten. Linda, right?
No, it's Robyn, but thank you.
Robyn, that was very interesting. And I would agree with John Morrison's assessment in the chat about time as the key limiting factor for our program. I'm curious though, when you talked about the amount of staff time it took you for particular Parks Canada projects, were you talking about just completing the assessment or actually filling the evidence gaps?
So it was completing the assessment and filling in the evidence sheet,
And
Doug.
just filling in the sheet. So, okay.
Yeah. So these were programs that were already in place. So they already had quite a bit of their information. What I've been doing recently, which has been interesting, is supporting another project in Cape Breton Highlands National Park, looking at the evidence for a decision they have to make about a conservation question. And that has been sort of from the basics. They had done a conservation standards workshop, but it was a couple of years ago. So we had to redo with Brenda and Sarah Cotter, we had to redo the situational diagram and so on. So I think that one with the redo is probably sitting at about 30 to 35 hours, but it's a fairly impactful decision for the park. So.
Okay, thank you.
Any other questions, comments, reflections?
I just wanted to comment, and I put this in the chat also, that I recall from way back when we first started having these robust conversations about, incorporating an analysis of the evidence base in our planning, that there was a rubric that someone developed to help teams decide how much investment to put into assessing the evidence. And it was kind of a, I don't know, quadrants that were based on, what is the risk level associated with, the strategy that you're planning to pursue? Like, if we do this wrong, could we cause the species to go extinct? Or could there be like severe reputational risk? And then on the other axis, I think was, how much of an investment are you planning to put into the intervention? If it's kind of a low hanging fruit, low investment, can't lose type strategy, then probably not much. But if this is like a millions of dollars multi-partner effort, you really want to make sure what you're doing is right, then you want to put it in. And so, your analysis would fall somewhere on those axes, and that would help you figure out how much time and effort you should put into this analysis. And I remember that being very useful when we first started thinking about these concepts.
Yeah, I would say in general, I would agree with that. I think it's consistent with that graph I showed you here. And I think one of the things about this approach, and I kind of mentioned this before, but let's see if I can say it a little more clearly now. I think this general approach can be used at all levels of intensity, right? You can kind of use this framework. And in fact, you don't even have to go into the deep. When Robyn showed you this high level summary, 5 questions, you could just fill out the evidence at this level and do a quick assessment of your current confidence in the evidence and not even expand it to all these detailed assumptions, right? You could do a really quick pass through your major questions and try to come up with them. Or you can break it down into these more specific questions and then at a high level rate the evidence base for each of these assumptions, maybe on degree of support weight of evidence, and quickly roll it up. Or you could take each of the individual sources and rate your confidence in them and then roll that up to get the rating here and then roll it up to get the rating here and roll that up to get the rating here. And you could do each of these criteria separately. We're agnostic in terms of how intensive or unintensive you want to be. It's up to the appetite of your team and the burden of proof situation, the degree of proof that you require that is needed. So I think that's always been a hallmark of conservation standards tools. At their best, they can be done quick and dirty, and they can be done in really detailed, and they support things at whatever level is appropriate. And so I'm pretty pleased that this is sort of falling out in that same tradition. And so I'm going to get a little grumpy if people say, well, you should be doing systematic reviews or you should be doing kind of more detailed stuff. There's nothing to stop you from doing systematic reviews using this approach. It's part of, you could do a systematic review for every one of these lines if you really want to, if you have the time and budget and inclination to do it.
Doug, I think I see in the chat that you have a question. I'll pass it over to you for a final question.
Well, thank you. So another follow-up on the Canadian Parks example, and maybe Nick, you would have a response to this as well, but so how do you make the case for program investment in this kind of an assessment? As you mentioned, Nick, there are a lot of burdens already on our conservation staff. And what worked in the case? Was it a top-down mandate, or what worked in kind of making that case?
Robyn, you want to take that?
Yeah, and I think Kent's on the call too, so feel free to jump in as you will, as you like, Kent. To my mind, this question that Nick's put back on the screen is really important. And I think the other important thing to say here is that our conservation staff are already doing this. Like, they're thinking about this, they're doing lit reviews, they're talking to locals. It's really just when they leave that position or that project, there's nothing behind, usually, unless people are really kick-ass at transition notes, which in my experience is not generally the case. There's nothing behind that lets somebody actually, we're hearing your answer phone, Nick. There's nothing for somebody to transition into with the state of knowledge. And so a lot of the interest that has been elicited, an example like the Atlantic Salmon Project, they reached out to their core project supporter and said, we're using this all the time to bring on new staff and to track where we're at in our program. So they took part in the pilot. They have no obligation to keep using this, but they are, because they're finding it a useful structure to hang their increasing knowledge on and to determine like what their next steps are. So that was very heartening to hear.
Thank you.
Nick, Robyn, any final words?
The only thing I'll say in conclusion is I would say this is still evolving. You can see it's gone through a number of changes over the last few years. Terminologies have changed, our way of thinking about it. I don't think we're done yet, but we're getting there and it's making some progress. So we'd love for you all to try it and give us feedback, and let's figure out how to improve this methodology and make it better.
And I do see a question, Brenda, in the chat about sharing the slides. I'm not totally sure on what is shared already through this platform. So maybe you could speak to that before we depart.
Sure. I know the meeting recording will be sent out. We can also share the slide deck as well. I don't think that's been shared, but we can if either you or Nick can share that with us. If you want to send that to me, I can get that out to folks. Great. Thank you, Nick and Robyn, for your time and your energy and sharing this approach with us. Really exciting and innovative stuff. And I really look forward to seeing how this evolves over time and how it gets rolled out and built into Marathi. And thank you all participants for joining the call today and hearing about this wonderful work. Have a wonderful day, everyone.
So,
thank you so much.
Thank
Thanks,
you,
everyone.
Bye.
Bye.